Firstly, Bernard, we are seeing the opposition to transgender medication and surgery gaining traction overseas. Can you give us a little glimpse of where the debate is, particularly in the UK, the US, and how Australia compares now?
Okay, well, in the UK, it centres around the Tavistock Gender Clinic. It is the largest youth gender clinic in the world. And what has happened there is that since about 2018, there's been detailed investigative journalism, there's been an official inquiry, and also litigation. And what's happening right now in relation to the Tavistock is that one of the journalists who's done this investigative work on the Tavistock, Hannah Barnes from the BBC, has published a book about the crisis. It's the first book about this crisis at the Tavistock. That book is generating a lot of media coverage in the UK and also here in Australia on the Australian newspaper. What's happening in the States is that...
Oh, sorry, before you move on, that book is called Time to Think, if I'm not mistaken. And has it even been published? I mean, you're saying it's generating a lot of debate. I'm not sure it's even available yet, is it?
Well, I've heard two different publication dates for it, but I mean, there's been a lot of coverage by journalists who've had advanced copies, and a fair bit of quoting from the book itself. If it's not available now, it should be available on the 23rd, I think, at the latest. Originally, I think that you can probably edit all this out, but originally I think it was to be published on February 16, but in the UK papers, the Times, the Sunday Times, the Guardian, also the BBC, there's very extensive coverage of the book, interviews with Hannah Barnes, news reporting, for example.
And what sort of revelations are they making? I mean, the last I know, there were, as far as I know, in 2020, there were roughly 2,700 kids went through the Tavistock Clinic. The majority of them, if I'm not mistaken, were given puberty blockers, which invariably, practice tells us, leads to transgender hormones and then sometimes onto surgery. So what sort of, is that a sort of fair summation of what was happening at Tavistock, and what new revelations are from this coming from this book?
Well, Fred, I think there's still uncertainty about exactly what percentage of kids who were referred to the Tavistock went down the medical path, starting with puberty blockers. And that's, believe it or not, still has not been clarified. But the thrust of the Hannah Barnes book is that this clinic became a sort of a one-size-fits-all place, and large numbers of kids with all sorts of different complex problems, as well as gender issues, were put on the medical path, starting with puberty blockers. And as you say, the evidence is that almost all the kids who start on puberty blockers go on to the irreversible opposite-sex hormones, which they're supposed to be taking for life. And I guess, one of the messages of Hannah Barnes' book is that once the gender issue arose, that's what everyone focused on. The other problems, and there were many of them for these kids, such as autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, also sometimes a frustrated or awkward same-sex attraction, all those other issues seemed to be put on hold. That those other issues were not dealt with or not treated, and it's possible that what looked like gender distress might in fact have been distress driven by those other underlying untreated causes. So if these kids went down the trans medical path, it's not necessarily going to make them all feel all that much better in the long run. Initially, of course, there's euphoria. They've got the medication they wanted. They've read about it all online. Friends and acquaintances are doing the same thing. There's a message that that everything improves dramatically once you embrace your trans identity, once you go down the medical path. But, it's still very early days, and there may be substantial regret ahead.